Our class today, our lesson today, is Lesson 8, Creation, Genesis as Foundation, Part 1, in the study guide, How to Interpret Scripture. And I like this title, Genesis as Foundation, because as the lesson points out, our entire understanding of reality is outlined in Genesis. You know, there are facts, and there are interpretations of facts. The biases, assumptions, presuppositions, beliefs that we hold impact how we take facts and interpret them to form conclusions and perspectives. The healthiest approach is, to the best of our ability, ensure that the beliefs, biases, premises, assumptions that we hold are in harmony with how reality actually works, with the evidence, and we don't deny facts and evidences just to hold to a premise or an assumption. Genesis lays out foundational basis for many beliefs that help us form frameworks for understanding reality. And here are some of those foundational beliefs. God is real, and God is a triune being of love. These are all laid out in Genesis. God is the creator. The earth and all life upon it were created by God. Human beings were created by God in God's image. God's laws are design laws, the protocols upon which reality is built. Sin is deviation from God's design, which brings suffering and death, and has its basis in lies, which undermine trust and love. Sin did not and does not come from God. Death, because of sin, does not come from God. The Sabbath, as an aid to assist human beings in cooperating with, is an aid to assist human beings in cooperating with God for holiness. God's plan to heal and to save is outlined in Genesis. The worldwide flood. The nature of humankind is mortal. Marriage and family. All of these understandings of how reality works have their foundation in Genesis. This is why Genesis is such an important book. As we undermine our belief in any of these foundational principles or beliefs, then we begin to corrupt our understanding of how reality works. And this happens in a variety of ways. Here's some of the ways these beliefs get undermined, and then our understanding of reality begins to be corrupted. There is no God. We evolved from slime or some other primordial soup. There is a God, but his law is imperial. It's a system of rules he makes up, and sin is breaking those rules, and therefore that God must use his power to inflict death upon lawbreakers. God uses death to create something called theistic evolution. The Sabbath is a concept, not a day. Or the Sabbath is strictly Jewish. Or the Sabbath is the seventh day, but it's an arbitrary test of obedience that God will punish you for if you don't obey. These are all corruptions of reality. And if we believe any of these, then our understanding of reality gets corroded. Here's more. Human beings have immortality and can never die. They might change forms, but they still live in some form. Marriage is an artificial construct made up by males to dominate society and have control over women. Women were created to be subordinate to men, or women were created equal, but God decided after sin that they should be subordinate to men. These are corrosive. There was no worldwide flood. Sin is a made-up concept by religions, which are also made up by people to control people. God's plan of salvation is to do something to God to pay for our sins so God won't either torture us or kill us. Genesis is just a book of myths. All of these ideas about Genesis, if you believe any of them, diminish your capacity for actually understanding reality. These are just some of the examples of how the foundational ideas can be corrupted. We achieve ever increasingly accurate understandings of reality when we use the integrative evidence-based approach, requiring our understanding of the scriptures to harmonize with nature and with real-life experiences. Sunday's lesson, Genesis 1, in the beginning, the creation story, when we consider the origins of life, there are really only two options, philosophically taught in the world. Oh, there's differences in details, but the grand themes, there's two grand themes. And one is an intelligent designer created life. The other is it came about on its own without any intelligent input at all. Spontaneous evolution on its own, or origins of life on its own. If we use the scientific method, which then we would want to do an experiment in which we observe outcomes that are reproducible and repetitive with the same outcomes over time, it doesn't apply. We can't go back to the origins of the universe and observe it. So we can't do an experiment directly to determine intelligent design or boom, bang, out of nothing, everything came. So we're left to test the premises that the two grand worldviews rest upon. And those are very testable. Godless origins versus God-created origins. Godless origins premise, there was nothing. And from that nothing, something came. Something came from nothing. That's testable. Can anyone show me that premise working in any capacity anywhere? The God-created one, there was something. And from that something came something else. That actually is proven every day around us. How about this one? Order and complexity came out of chaos and disorder all on its own without any intelligent input. That's very testable. And if you put it in a lab, if you test that, if you experiment over and over again, the same outcomes happen. It never happens. Conversely, order and complexity came out of disorder and complexity by an intelligent being bringing order and complexity. That's extremely testable. We do that every day of our lives. Life came from non-living matter. That's the Big Bang, the godless origins. Somebody show me that. I'd love to see that. Just all on its own, no human involvement, no intelligent involvement, just boom. Inorganic material becomes living. Or life came from other living organisms. We see that all the time. DNA gains information through mutation. Or DNA degrades through mutation. Both are very testable and have been proven now. Now, if you notice these premises, this is not a mixed bag. Oh, some of the premises are true in the one theory, and some of the premises are true in the other theory. It's not that way. 100% of them are true for the creation intelligent model, and 100% of them are false for the godless model. Further, living organisms require three elements to actually exist. And those are physical matter, the atoms and molecules that make up the organism, energy. In the biblical worldview, you call that life energy, but if you're dealing with somebody who doesn't, the breath of life from God, that's the energy, the breath of life. But if you're dealing with somebody who doesn't believe in God, then you can just point them to the energy that comes from the molecular actions that produce energy, like the breakdowns of sugars and so forth, but it still requires energy. And the third is the coded information contained in our DNA. The godless theories of origins postulates and focuses exclusively on their experiments on how physical matter might have come about. After the Big Bang, there was some primordial soup with these different elements in it, and then there was electrical sparks, and they somehow sparked together to form amino acids, and over the eons of time, they formed DNA molecules. And this is what this is the tripe that they put out to our children, that somehow this actually is reasonable. From my book, The Aging Brain, Proven Steps to Prevent Dementia and Sharpen Your Mind, I'm going to share a little section. The idea that living beings originated on their own without any intelligent input would be similar to believing that a storm arose with high winds, rain, and lightning that raged for years, and during this storm a strong winds blew rocks and sands at high speed until some were shattered and worn down to form the letters of the alphabet. This is analogous to believing that random forces of nature in some chemical soup with lightning strikes eventually form DNA molecules. But even if we accept that this happened, which is a big leap of blind, evidenceless faith. Get your mind around that. The whole premise of godless origins is built on blind, evidenceless faith that actually goes against the scientific evidence. Scientists still ignore the most critical aspect of what is required for life: the encoded information contained in the organized DNA sequences. Having an alphabet does not mean we have usable and functional information. To believe that random forces brought life about would require we not only believe the alphabet formed all on its own, but beyond this we must also believe that the winds, rains, and lightning strikes all on its own organized the letters into the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. Yet this is exactly what millions of good-hearted, honest-thinking people do believe. I go on to ask the question, but why would thinking, honest-of-heart scientists choose to believe something that the evidence refutes? Because the historical alternative belief system is significantly more destructive. And what is the historical alternative belief system from which this godless theory arose? The belief in an all-powerful God who functions no differently than the worst despots in human history, a God who says, "Love me, I'll burn you in hell forever." This grotesque God construct, rightly rejected by reasonable people, is pointedly described by Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. And this is what they reject, and it leaves them with this other. This is what he says. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. No, if that's how you see God, which is the God that is taught in imperial systems, an authoritative bully, if do it my way, I'm going to torture and kill you. If that's your worldview, then you see that believing in no God is actually better. So in my view, the reason good-hearted people reject God and the Genesis account is because they have only been given two options. And both of them are lies. God as a big bully, an authoritarian dictator who's the source of pain and suffering, or no God. This is why the three angels' message is so important, the three angels of Revelation, because at this time in human history, God is calling for people to stand up and call people back to worship the Creator, Him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. It calls people back to worship the designer and His laws as design protocols. It calls people away from the imperial dictator views of God to embrace the Creator God, which means we have to stop teaching this penal legal theologies and start teaching the reality that we're sick and God wants to heal us. So which worldview is more reasonable? The view of our Creator God of love who built reality to operate on design laws of truth, love, freedom, and other design laws. Second paragraph states, Darwinian evolution is contrary to Scripture in every way and attempts by some to harmonize it with the Bible makes Christians look silly. Darwinian evolution is the concept that a species evolves over millions of years by mutation of the DNA, which confers new and improved abilities, allowing them to compete more effectively in an environment and reproduce over those who are less capable now, and thus, naturally over time, the less capable are selected out and don't pass their genetic information along, and the species is advanced over time. A couple of points to understand. Darwinian evolutionary theories do not address origin science. When you use evolution, that's things adapting and changing over time. You first have to have life in order for it to evolve. So Darwinian evolutionary theories just begins describing what's happening now. It does not deal with how life began in the first place. So don't confuse evolution, and people say evolution, with origins. They're actually different concepts. There has never been any scientific evidence given of one species mutating into another species. Called transmutation. It's never been demonstrated. This theory is still taught, but it's taught without evidence. In fact, it's taught in the face of contradicting evidence. Evolution, the process of a species changing or evolving based on environmental pressures, does occur because God created us in his image with the capacity to adapt and change and then have beings in our image. So as we change ourselves, then our children are going to be more like how we have become. So we have the capacity to adapt and change. That's evolution. Natural selection is the process of the least fit being less capable of competing for resources and thus dying out of a population and no longer passing their genetic material along. They're naturally selected out and traits are lost, or you can put it the other way, more adaptive traits are retained. But selecting out the least capable in a population, or another way to say it, the most damaged, is not the same as saying those who survive are advancing and improving. The idea of natural selection takes the observation that the least fit don't survive and draws a false conclusion, a lie, in fact, that that is the core to the entire evolutionary theory. This lie, it's all built on a lie. Not natural selection that occurs. That's not the lie. The lie is, since the least fit don't survive, then the more fit that survive in the population is actually advancing from the generation before. This is not so. In fact, all members of every generation of a population is genetically downgraded or degraded or damaged when compared to the generation before it. With every human generation, they've looked at this now with DNA science and genetic science, there's a minimum of 1,000 new damaging gene mutations in our DNA that the generation before us didn't have. I have 1,000 more than my parents, 2,000 more than my grandparents, 3,000 more than my great-grandparents, and so forth. With every generation, a species loses genetic vitality. It doesn't gain it. Now, within my generation, if some mutations are so bad that those people can't reproduce, then they don't adapt well, they are not retained in society. That's natural selection. They're selected out. So those really bad ones are lost from the next generation, but that's not saying my genes got better. My genes still got worse. The whole species is still degrading. Evolutionary theory has essentially only two truths. Things adapt and change over time, and natural selection selects out the least fit. All the other so-called points of evolution are proven false. Here's some of the points they claim, but they're just proven. It's not just theoretically, proven false. Species advance via mutation of the DNA code. False. Every gene mutation that has ever been identified thus far diminishes DNA vitality, damages the DNA code, takes away information, does not add vitality. Species evolve from one to another through mutation. This has never been demonstrated. It's not true. Darwin's original theory, represented by his observation of the different types of beaks that finches have. Some have beaks that are short for grubs, some have beaks that are long for getting into little wood spaces for insects, and the different shapes of the beaks he hypothesized was adaptation over millions of years that allowed them to compete better in different environments that they tend to habit for their habitat. But this has been tested now with DNA science. They actually took the different finches and they looked at their DNA sequences, and guess what? They have the same DNA sequences. No mutations occurred. What they discovered, in fact, was that within 1 to 2 generations of an environmental pressure change, like needing to get grubs instead of needing to peck somewhere else, epigenetic modifications, these signals, little molecules that sit above the DNA telling the DNA how to express itself, modified the shape of the next generation in the beaks. And this happened in 1 to 2 generations. I've got the scientific references in the notes for those who'd like to go check those resources. which is exactly what the Bible teaches, that we change ourselves. And we pass those changes down 3 and 4 generations. Now, what's interesting, Ellen White, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and a contemporary of Charles Darwin, living at the same time Darwin lived, had a different view of these things than Darwin. Rather than millions of years, she took the approach that we change ourselves in real time, and those changes pass down through the generations to our children. This would be consistent with epigenetic modification, which we now know is true, but she didn't even know anything about gene science, but somehow she was able to get this right. And I'm going to give you a couple of quotes which were quite profound, thinking that these were written in the 19th century. This is out of first volume, Mind, Character, Personality, 136. Parents, by indulgence, have strengthened their animal passions. And as these have strengthened, the moral and intellectual faculties have become weak. The spiritual has been overborne by the brutish. Children are born with the animalistic propensities largely developed. The parents' own stamp of character have been given to them. The brain force is weakened. The memory becomes deficient. The sins of the parents will be visited upon the children because the parents have given them the stamp of their own lustful propensities. This would be if you engage in doing alcohol, drugs, and things in your adolescence and you don't get into recovery, you will pass along greater risks of addiction problems to your kids. It's well-known science now. This is not mutating your DNA code. You're epigenetically altering how it's developed, which will alter how the child's brain develops, which will alter the actual propensities in the child. This is strong neuroscience and genetic science now. How did she know that? Here's another one. This is out of Mind, Character, Personality, page 139. The nobler aims, the higher the mental and spiritual endowments, and the better developed the physical powers of the parents, the better will be the life equipment they give their children. In cultivating that which is best in themselves, parents are exerting an influence to mold society and to uplift future generations. So it goes both directions. We do unhealthy things, we pass it along. We do mature and healthy things, we pass advantages along to our kids. Epigenetic science shows this as well. No DNA sequencing, though. And then these two are quite interesting, and I'm going to show you some actual science that confirm these. Mind, Character, Personality, 131. Every woman about to become a mother, whatever may be her surroundings, should encourage constantly a happy, cheerful, contented disposition, knowing that for all her efforts in this direction, she will be repaid tenfold in the physical as well as the moral character of her offspring. And then the next quote is Mind, Character, Personality, Volume 1, page 132. The thoughts and feelings of the mother will have a powerful influence upon the legacy she gives her child. If she allows her mind to dwell upon her own feelings, if she indulges in selfishness, if she is peevish and exacting in disposition, peevish and exacting, the disposition of her child will testify to the fact. Thus many have received as a birthright almost unconquerable tendencies to evil. Okay? Now, what's the brain science show? A study of 4,000 mothers and their children followed for 18 years found that mothers with negative, pessimistic, depressogenic thinking patterns when pregnant increased the risk of their child having depression 18 years later. This association remained after accounting for other maternal-child variables that could be linked. In fact, the data concluded that such depressogenic thinking increased the risk of depression in the child by 21%. And then studies show that mothers who are highly stressed during pregnancy, and this could be from negative, worried, anxious, pessimistic thinking, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a mother who's got generally mature thinking, but she goes through a trauma during pregnancy. Her husband gets killed in a car accident. Her husband gets deployed into a war zone. Her mother gets diagnosed with cancer. Something traumatic happens during pregnancy. But if that happens and she doesn't handle that very quickly to resolve her stress, if she stays in a highly stressed state, then her stress hormones elevate, and those stress hormones cross the placental barrier. They cross the developing blood-brain barrier, and through epigenetic modification alter the developing brain, so the child is born with a brain that is less capable of turning off its fear circuitry, so the child is born more anxious, more fearful, less socially capable than the child would have been had the mother not been highly stressed during pregnancy. So neuroscience and genetic science are confirming what Ellen White wrote about, which is the biblical worldview, and refuting what Darwin wrote about, which is the godless worldview. The lesson points out in the third paragraph that God as creator not only created physical matter, but also time, and as such lives outside of time. This is quite important and true. God lives on a plane of existence beyond our full experience or capacity even to process and understand. Some people can't process this. They can't handle it and believe that if God lives outside of time, and because he lives outside of time, and he is basically in all points of time simultaneously, past, present, and future, and knows all points of time, and somehow therefore knows our future choices, then they conclude, well, then we're not free. We're just pre-programmed robots. Now, because the people who have this position are sensitive to God's character of love, and they realize that love requires freedom, they, with the best intentions, create a lie that God doesn't know the future. He has no foreknowledge. Or he could know it. He has the ability to know it, but he voluntarily puts a blindfold on himself and won't look because by looking he would take away our choice. It's all based on false premises. That somehow God's awareness of the future is either deterministic to us, pre-programs us, takes liberty. It's quite simple, really. To God, who lives outside of time, what is it that informs him of our future choices? Note, it's future to us. It's actually not future to God because he actually doesn't really exist in linear time like we do. It's really difficult for us to process. But what is it that informs him of the choice we're going to make next year? Are actually making the choice. If we never make the choice, that action never happens, that data never happens, that information never occurs. God's never made aware of it because it never happened. And so it's our actual choice that informs him of the choice we're going to make, which keeps us completely free and at liberty. Another point to make about Genesis 1:1 is simply that when it uses the language "in the beginning, God created," it is not speaking of the beginning of all things. It's speaking of the beginning of this planet and this solar system. And we know this because in Job chapter 38, verse 7, it informs us that the angels sang together for joy when the foundations of the earth were laid. They couldn't be singing for joy when earth was created if they weren't already created beforehand. So the narrative of Genesis 1 is the narrative of God at some time in the past coming to this portion of the Milky Way to create planet Earth and our solar system, the sun, moon, and stars of our solar, Venus, Mercury, Mars, and so forth. Not the whole universe. And when you understand that, then you can have harmony with the fact that the universe may in fact be billions of years old, while life on Earth was created much more relatively close, thousands of years ago. Monday's lesson, the lesson points out that Genesis teaches that the earth was created during a 7-day week.